From the University of Nebraska at Omaha, this is NCITE Insights. I'm your host, Callie Vitro. Welcome to NCITE Insights. My name is Callie Vitro. I'm an NCITE researcher and criminology doctoral student at UNO. Today, I'll be hosting this episode. Our guest is NCITE Research Associate Dr. Michael Becker, and we'll be discussing all things methods. Okay, so we are going to touch on three broad points today. First, we'll talk about how we get data. Second, what we do with that data. And then third, we're going to try to tie that to an actual NCITE project that you are on, the NCITE Geospatial project. I want to start with the most basic question around this topic. Why should we care about data generating processes? For some listeners, this might sound incredibly boring. So why is this one of the most interesting topics that we need to study for research?
So to kind of dive into it, I think we can think about it like this. Imagine you're really excited to build your dream home. You've got incredible blueprints, an amazing architect, and the best construction team that money can buy. But what if right from the start, the materials that you're working with are junk? The wood's warped, the bricks are crumbling, or the cement mix is all wrong. So no matter how perfectly you follow the plans or how skilled the builders are, that house is just not going to stand strong. It's the same with data. So our blueprints are like the smart research questions and the cool models that we use for analysis. Our construction team, that's the fancy software, the algorithms, and all the different ways that we kind of try and estimate these impacts. But if the data themselves are fundamentally flawed, or there's something that goes into producing those materials because of the way that they were collected or generated, we might just miss crucial details. And even with kind of the fanciest potential algorithms with the analyses that we think are at the cutting edge, that's going to give us shaky and unreliable answers. So just like a house built with shoddy materials, it's going to show cracks, and the decisions that we try to make based on those data are going to be flawed and lead to additional problems.
Thank you, Michael. That was an incredible example as to why these are so important. So let's dive in. Let's start with the very first thing, how we get data. What are the major sources of data that you think are relevant to criminological research more broadly and then terrorism more generally?
Sure. So generally speaking, we think about data in a couple different buckets. The first is whether it is an official or an unofficial source of data. Official data generally come from government agencies, law enforcement, or large intergovernmental organizations like the UN. It's usually standardized, collected in some repeated systematic fashion. And what they're doing is they're trying to get as much coverage as possible. So if you think of examples like census data, law enforcement data, such as the UCR, the Uniform Crime Reports, or the National Incident-Based Response System, NIBRS, those are examples of official data. Unofficial data is the other big bucket that we tend to work with. And this is usually from non-governmental organizations like NGOs, activist groups, academic researchers like ourselves, or you can even get some unofficial data from social media and other types of metrics. And while some of those data are collected for specific advocacy purposes or kind of understanding very niche community issues, often it is very useful in that it presents a different perspective than what would normally come through government sources. It can fill gaps. It can give us a more granular set of insights than those official data might otherwise miss.
Okay, so there's a lot of criminology research or discourse around a lot of these sources of data, right? And there are definitely consequences to some of these data sources or problems with these data. Can you run us through just a little bit or an example of some of the problems that you can experience if you end up using one data source over the other?
Yeah, sure. And so coming back to the idea of what a data generating process is, it's the way that the data gets to our desk. It's not necessarily what is objectively happening in reality, but what are the potential hurdles that any event, case, or measurement need to jump over before they get to us. In terms of kind of more standard crime data, if you're thinking about the Uniform Crime Reports, it is based on cases that have been investigated by the police. Now, if no one reports a potential crime to a police officer or it gets through the courts in some other fashion, that would never show up in the UCR. So if we don't have a good sense of what are the potential filter points for those data, we can't really understand what might be shifting the way that we understand our answers when we do analyses.
Give me an example in the UCR of types of crimes that are often not reported and how that could really sway some of these things that you're talking about.
Yeah, so again, for the UCR, it is based on crimes that are reported to police, and there is either a clearance or a clearance by exception means, meaning that the police officers are reasonably confident that they have a good sense of who committed the crime, and clearance by exceptional means is usually after the fact when someone may have been, or the perpetrator may have been killed in the act. So they still know who it is, but they probably didn't end up getting charged. This raises potential offenses like, for example, injection drug use. That's a type of crime that typically is not reported to the police because often it is something that people are doing in their own, usually, hopefully, safe space. Other types of crime that tend to be underreported are domestic violence. Because we know that there are concerns around repercussions for approaching law enforcement. And in the past, there have been concerns about the way that officers do or do not find certain potential victims as credible. So there are all sorts of social processes that inform why someone would or would not consider reporting a crime to the police, and further, why those crimes would or would not be investigated and charged and ultimately prosecuted.
Thank you. So it sounds like, depending on what you're interested in, and maybe even overall, if you use an official data source like the UCR, you might not be able to fully investigate your question to the extent that you should or would want to. So what are some things that you can do? How should we be approaching these questions if one data source alone is not sufficient to answer them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's the beauty of working in teams, because when we have a bunch of different researchers from different disciplines and different trainings that approach questions from their own kind of specific methodological angles and using different data sources, that gives us a much more complete picture. It's a phenomenon we call triangulation. And so while you may have someone who focuses on the UCR data or NIBRS, which are very good data sources and the best that we have for that type of data, if you have someone who also looks at instances from either a victimology perspective or people who focus on survey research to look at kind of how individuals experience the threat of these types of crimes or experience kind of how they feel safe in their communities as a consequence of it. Really kind of pulling in different angles on it is what I would say is generally the best practice for how to answer these kinds of questions.
Okay, so moving on a little bit past those major official sources of data or unofficial, but some of the big ones that we think of, just curious, in your career, how have some of these methods for getting data evolved? How have you seen the evolution? What do you see moving forward with this? What are those next steps that you think will be really big sources of data?
Yeah, I mean, so big data is kind of the name of the game. At least recently, we've seen a significant increase in data sets that are available to the public that have not thousands, but tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of observations. And this has meant that we've had to kind of learn to retrain our models to understand what is a statistically significant effect versus what is something that is useful. Because often when you have that much data, almost everything is going to come out at the end as statistically significant because it's a very, very precise measurement of something that might be very, very small. But in terms of understanding and shifting where some of these problems might be occurring and understanding what solutions might be, understanding what the substantive impact of different kinds of interventions or different variables are is really key. As far as where I've seen some of these data go in the last 5-10 years, there's been a significant increase in the use of novel data sources. So myself, I have worked on some web scraping projects to understand broader sentiment on extremist message boards. And I'm interested in understanding how people shift in response to kind of external events. Well, that's not something that's going to show up necessarily in official data or often even in data that are produced by advocacy groups or other types of NGOs. So finding clever ways to use the different ways that we talk to each other, communicate with each other, and interact, and really pulling that information together.
Very cool. So we have these massive data sets, and some of those official data sets are also pretty big, but you're talking about these with millions of observations. So a lot of researchers, you get all of these data. What do you then do? Because you can't always use every single thing that you found in this data set. So what are those next steps before you really start jumping into analysis to get that data in the right stage for that?
Yeah, so once we've kind of decided on where we're starting with these data sources or what the sampling frame might be, we have to think about how we're going to get a representative portion of these data. And then ultimately how we're going to measure the concepts, because this all should boil back down to what are our key research questions, and that should be guided by theory. So I also want to flag that there's a really interesting and critical methodological point around what are the consequences of missing when we're trying to get a representative portion of our data. A paper by one of my colleagues, Dr. Darren Fisher, recently illustrated this using Bayes' theorem, which is a bit more technical than I probably want to get into for a podcast audience. But briefly, the probability of a given event conditional on certain preceding characteristics is almost never the same as the probability of an event. So, for example, if we had a sample of people who had previously committed acts of violent extremism, and they were all men, or there was some other demographic factor or exposure, then we would potentially conclude that, well, all males are at higher risk of becoming violent extremists. But we also know that most men, or people who identify as males, or people who have any other single factor, have not and will not commit acts of violent extremism. So viewing a specific attribute within people who have engaged in some kind of high risk or violent behavior as a risk factor is often misleading. And it's sometimes more valuable to look at what are the things that restrain people from it. In kind of more technical jargon, we talk about this as sampling on the dependent variable. If you're only looking at cases that are ones, so people who've already done something, you can't really identify what differentiates the high-risk actors from people who may share a lot of attributes but didn't end up actually going on and doing that violent behavior.
So it sounds like coming together, just there's a lot of different issues depending on how you either decide to collect these data or what data source you end up using. It sounds like we need a wide variety of data sources, and to sum up, like a big team that specializes in different types of data sources to make sure that we are really answering all those questions. I think these are really good problems that you bring up that I think we should be thinking about in every single project that we do. So let's now start moving into that second point. So we have all these data, we've sampled properly, we've decided what we're going to do to move forward. What are those next steps? What do we do now that we have these data?
Yeah, so there are a few general approaches that people in the field have tended to take. My background training is as a criminologist, and that means that I was largely brought up in a school where econometrics or behavioral econometrics was kind of the name of the game. So behavioral econometrics focuses on regression-based modeling. You're trying to identify a potential causal relationship between something that you can really pull the lever on and the outcome of interest. There are other approaches, however. So in my undergrad, I was taught as a psychometric researcher, which is much more interested in kind of the broader patterns of associations between different variables and thinking not about individual kind of factors as a very easy, discrete, and countable observation, but as indicators of some type of a latent pattern. So we're not saying I can hold anger in my hand or measure it very directly, but what are these 7 survey questions that if you answer, I can get a pretty good sense of what your current level of anger is when you're answering the survey. Often it's quite high. People don't really enjoy surveys. And the third approach is a bit more common lately, and it's what we generally describe as the data science approach. And this is focused on large data sets, predictive modeling, and identifying patterns with computational methods. And it's more about how can I very, very, very best explain some outcome or predict some outcome than necessarily focusing on the theoretical framework that you're using.
Yeah, so you talked a little bit about theory earlier, and you just brought it up again. Can you just give a little bit more of a dive into that balance between this analysis approach and the theory that you should be including, hopefully, in your overarching research?
Yeah, sure. So theory at its very most basic is I think that there's a relationship between two things. And when one thing changes, I suspect, or I have reason to believe that something else will happen to kind of the second concept that I have in mind. The value of that in its very most simplistic form is I have an idea of what lever I can pull to change an outcome. If, however, we're taking an atheoretical approach or we're including a whole slew of variables or observations that might not really be giving any kind of discriminatory validity, or it's not really giving us any edge in terms of like what we can do with the analysis, then we tend to just be kind of sitting in a black box. We know that this is very, very good at predicting an outcome, but we might not know how to actually change the incidence of that outcome or what might be the negative externalities if we pull one lever versus another. So theory really gives us the mechanism. And again, this is where I would just kind of shout out some of the folks who do qualitative research. I think that it is absolutely essential because while the folks in the quant space are often very, very enthusiastic about our big data methods, having an understanding of kind of the ground truth in the story and how it is perceived by different perspectives is really the way that you can have more granular tests of those theories.
That's a really good point. I think it's important to bring up because neither of us specialize in that qualitative space and maybe don't understand it as well. It would be super interesting to also get some of that qualitative methodology here in a future podcast. But clearly, these are very important things for quantitative to be thinking about and also do that branch over of those mixed methods research. And again, having a large team to really support that work. So we're running out of time. So let's branch that into how important it is to have diverse teams like we do at NCITE. And you're currently working on a pretty big team, a diverse team for this geospatial project. Can we just give a very broad overview for people who don't yet know what that geospatial project is and maybe what your role is on that project?
Sure. So this is a project led by the good Dr. Austin Doctor and partnered with some of the folks at the University of Maryland College Park START team. And we are looking at understanding terrorist innovation, and in particular around the use of emerging geospatial technologies such as unmanned systems or drones, Internet of Things devices like your Alexa or Google Home. I hope I didn't just activate them. And also other geospatial information systems. And the part of the project that I'm particularly focusing on is looking at the dual use of technologies. So this is tech or data that have a legitimate civilian application, but can also be adapted or repurposed for either military intelligence or other malicious purposes, which is to say, we know that the bad guys, as it were, can and do use geospatial data for planning, executing, and exploiting attacks after they've already happened.
Okay, so clearly very important work, especially right now as all these new emerging techs are still coming out. Let's go down a little bit more granular, though. Let's step back and think about it in the context of what we've been talking about. Can you describe one aspect of your project that you feel like hits on these conversations about measurement and the importance of making those decisions during that project?
Sure. So one of the specific areas that we're focusing on for this study right now is using a survey experiment or a conjoint to try and understand why different data managers might be more or less likely to approve of a request for geospatial data. Because we know that these kinds of data are both a public good that people want to use for legitimate reasons, and also something that can be exploited by nefarious actors. And so understanding which factors might make someone who's working in a county office or the city planning commission, what might make them more or less likely to actually approve of a request for these data. So the conjoint approach is a kind of a survey experiment that helps us understand which of the features of that request move the needle for people the most and which levels of those features are most impactful. And in terms of how this relates to the broader conversation, we were able to generate what I think is pretty interesting method of mimicking what a real life request for these data might look like. And while that sounds a bit intuitive, often when you're using different kinds of approaches, you may be kind of shoehorned into a bit more crude presentations. And so while kind of the native presentation within Qualtrics, the survey platform that we use, is a gray box that has a lot of different text showing, okay, well, these are the different levels. We were able to programmatically generate a data request form in R and in Python so that it would look as though they were seeing an actual application for those data. And the value of this is that it improves our external validity. It means that what we're finding here is more likely to generalize to other kinds of situations because it is a better reflection of reality. Often these folks aren't going to see just a little gray box and make a check yes or no. They're going to see a more complete application, or in some cases incomplete. And that is going to weigh on their decision-making process more accurate.
Right. So when the people are taking the survey, instead of just seeing and feeling like they are still in this survey, they're going to see something that looks more like they are making an actual decision about an actual document that could have come to them to approve this request, right? So I think in the video version of this, we'll try to put some visuals up so you can see the difference between that Qualtrics approach that looks like a survey that Michael is talking about, and then this really cool conjoint that he's created on more of a realistic looking document. So I think that would be really cool visual for people to just understand why this is so important for this project. What are you hoping to, or what are your theoretical drives to this project? What do you think that you'll find when you actually collect all these data?
Yeah, I mean, so our hope is that the respondents are able to identify what we have kind of pre-hoc considered as high-risk data requests. We do also know, however, that often these are people who are flooded with a lot of work. And so being able to kind of pick apart every potential data request might just simply be more than they have kind of the bandwidth to do. So as a part of this, we're also going to be looking at what is their potential workload and how that might contribute to their ability to discern between risky and non-risky data requests. And ultimately, the goal is we want to be able to do something that helps guide that decision-making process, whether that's just a report so that people who work in this space are better able to flag potential risks, or if it's something where we can help develop a system that is able to kind of collate information from a kind of known and trusted requester and say, well, you probably don't need to spend as much time reviewing this one versus a new actor in the space. And you're saying, okay, well, you should really go with a fine-tooth comb on this one.
That's really important. I think that also kind of speaks more broadly to the importance of this flow during this project, starting with the idea of how we're going to collect these data, moving into what then you'll do with them once you collect them. But then third, having these actionable, tangible outcomes. So these things are rooted in real world problems and hopefully real world solutions for people who need this kind of information. So I think that's incredibly interesting. Thank you for giving us an overview, and we look forward to staying apprised of all the updates in this research. Michael, thank you for sitting down to chat. It is always a pleasure. Our guest today was NCITE's Dr. Michael Becker. If you have questions about Michael's work, his email is mbecker26@nebraska.edu. It will also be listed below in the podcast information. Thank you for listening.
This series is produced by Ben Badafarano, Aaron Grace, Scott Jordan, and Blake Ersch. Thank you for joining us for another episode of NCITE Insights. The National Counterterrorism Innovation, Technology, and Education Center, or NCITE, is an academic center of excellence for the Department of Homeland Security. Looking to find out more? Check out our website at incite.unomaha.edu or email us at incite@unomaha.edu.